This is Creepy and Geeky, a part of the Morbidly Beautiful Podcast Network. Welcome to Creepy and Geeky. I'm your host, Robert, and on today's show, we're continuing our series on horror trilogies with the Re-Animator series. Joining me for this exploration into the world of HP Lovecraft is my son, Harrison. Harrison is also the host of the Saber Vista YouTube channel. Welcome back to the show, Harrison.
Salutations.
All right. So we are talking some Lovecraft, and I know you're a fan of his work.
I am.
And a fan of cosmic horror in general, which we've talked about a couple of times on the show already. So I keep trying to introduce some new movies to you that you might be interested in. And you seem to be fairly agreeable to this series as a whole. So
yeah, you've been sending me a lot of different interpretations of cosmic horror, but tonight we're talking about a literal adaptation.
Yes. Yeah, these first two movies are the Re-Animator and Bride of Re-Animator. Re-Animator itself is an adaptation of the first half of the HP Lovecraft stories called Herbert West Re-Animator. And then Bride of Re-Animator is based on the second half of that story. But Beyond Re-Animator, and that's the reason why it's called Beyond Re-Animator, is not associated with the Re-Animator story at all. It's just a continuation of the movie storyline at that point.
Very much not part of the
original. Yeah. So, and Harrison's actually read the original stories by Lovecraft that these are based on, so he'll have some good reference knowledge as we talk about this about these movies. So
I got the book right in front of
me. So good. You're more prepared than I am, which is usual for most of my guests. So, but yeah, no, it's so we got we'll jump right in. We're gonna talk the first Re-Animator movie, which came out in 1985, directed by Stuart Gordon, produced by Brian Usna, who is very important to the rest of the series as well, as he directs the next two installments. Starring Jeffrey Combs, Barbara Crampton, and I forgot the other people again. Let me look it up again.
I mean, there's a lot of people in these movies.
Yeah. Well, this one specifically is Jeffrey
also
Combs,
a lot of big
Bruce
horror
Abbott.
names. Like people kind of either got their start in this or this kind of perpetuated their career.
Yeah. So Jeffrey Combs, Bruce Abbott, Barbara Crampton, and David Gale are the big name major actors in this one. So, and Barbara Crampton, it's one of her earlier movies. And same for Jeffrey Combs. It's Stuart Gordon's first movie, as he came from a theater background. And he, so the interesting thing about this is that he was talking to a friend, and they were discussing that there were a lot of vampire movies, and he wanted to do a Frankenstein movie. And so this friend said, "Hey, have you ever read Re-Animator?" And he had not. He had read most of Lovecraft's work, but except for that one. And after reading that, then he was excited. He started to, originally he pitched it as a theater thing, but then realized it wasn't going to work. Then tried to pitch it as a television show. And in the 80s, they said, yeah, that won't work. Horror is better in the movies. And so that's when somebody introduced him to Brian Usna, and they managed to cobble together what they did. And it's now a cult classic of the 80s.
Well, just speaking on the source material, I don't
Yeah,
know how someone would. A stage play I can understand, but a
right.
TV show seems a little ambitious based on the source material alone.
Well, I mean, obviously they'd have to, flesh it out and everything,
Flesh
to
it out.
fits. Yeah, yeah. They'd have to flesh it out a bit to make it work as a television show, I'm sure. But and I guess they were looking at something like a 13 episode season. So
Okay.
something not super long.
Yeah, I
But
mean, there's a certain
I
episodic nature to the original text that could
right,
have lent itself to a television show. I think that to a certain degree, it may have allowed them to accomplish a couple things that I think were weaker parts of the movies. But
right.
I think that number one, I think that the first movie stands fantastic alone, and
Oh yeah,
and then the second movie is just extra fun. That's kind of how I feel about the second one. It just picks
right,
up where it left off and then kind of wraps up the narrative of Herbert West if you're satisfied with the ending that it gives you.
right. Yeah, no, I think that if you never watch any of the other movies, that if you just watch the first Reanimator, you're pretty set.
Yeah,
I think the other movies are okay and they have their unique charms to them, but I think that just watching this first one, you get enough. Um, you know,
absolutely.
but there, like I said, there's some fun stuff in the later ones, but this one's just classic all on its own. And I think that's the reason why most people, when you talk about Reanimator, most people just talk about the first one. You don't really hear too much about people talking about the other two. That's fair.
Mm.
I mean, it's I think they're good. They're not great. I think the first one really stands head and shoulders above them all, pun mostly intended. And but yeah, no, this one's just a lot of fun. And apparently though the comedy wasn't in the first draft of the screenplay, and they kind of like went through, like, as they were gearing it for production and stuff like that, they started tinkering with it and adding more and more of the humor into it, which I think helps. And it's got like, and it's not like funny like something like an Evil Dead, or a Shaun of the Dead or something like that, where the comedy's like kind of in your face. This one's more really dark.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
to me,
yeah,
it's the best kind of horror comedy because it retains its horrific narrative and nature to it while having comedic brevity to kind of wake the audience up from the insanity that they're watching.
right. Yeah, I think it does a good job with that. That I think that it's definitely not as funny as as something like I said, like an Evil Dead, or um uh Shaun of the Dead or something like that, where it's billed more as a comedy. Reanimator seems much more of a horror first with some comedic elements, and which are good. They're
Going,
good comedic elements
yeah,
for sure.
going back to
Um,
the theater aspect of the film,
hey,
because
right,
there is very much a theatricalness about the film
right,
in terms of like a more stage oriented sensation that a lot of the comedy comes off as like really powerful one liners that like the
right,
character could belt out into the theater to kind of get
mhm,
aroused
right,
and that's the kind of fun of it is that whenever the funny stuff happens like it kind of lands well. Also I think just because Jeffrey Combs gets a lot of the comedic lines
right, yeah,
in regards to his character and he does a fantastic job of portraying Herbert West in terms of how the text presents him in terms of a
interesting.
cold,
Okay,
uncaring, and purely scientific mind to where
right,
even he I feel as though through this film and the way he portrays the character, he carries that through with almost a cold sarcasm to whenever he's uh, presented with
right.
an inferior intellect in a way. And that's where a lot of the best lines come from.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, I think that, it's definitely, you mentioned that about like him being this cold doctor and stuff. And we discussed this before about how he cares only about the science. He doesn't
Yes.
even necessarily care about himself or
Nope.
anybody else. Like he literally cares nothing about the subjects that he's injecting this serum into. They are just
He
literally
has,
subjects to him.
yeah, he has the same cold attachment to the humans that he uses and the corpses that he uses
Right.
for his experiments, the same way that a scientist would have cold attachment for like animals, like mice or
Right.
some other kind of test animal. Like they're
Exactly.
they are a means
They're
to an
literally
end.
just testing subjects. Yeah. And he's just trying to perfect this serum. He's trying to
Mm-hmm.
unlock the secrets of life after death.
Mm-hmm.
And, and that's all that matters. And you see that specifically at the very end as he's, supposedly dying, and as far as we know, if you only watch the first movie, you think he's dying, he's going to be dead. And then he throws his bag with the serum and the notes and to Dan, his partner, and who he's mostly roped into this. Dan didn't really want to have anything to do with any of this. And so he throws his notes and is just like, take my research, finish my research. So like
Mm-hmm.
he's all about just the science. Like he knows he's gonna die, but he doesn't care. He wants the formula and everything,
Yeah, yeah. For
continued
for
on.
him, at least inside of the movies, his the whole kind of impetus of the first film is Herbert battling Dr. Hill with their interpretations of where the will of the body comes from. And for Herbert, he believes that will is is not something nebulous. It's something that is just inherent in the human body, and he's trying to prove that by reanimating the bodies to showcase how even after death, will continues. That
Right.
even after all processes stop, the heart stops, the brain stops, that there's still will and rational thought within the body. Versus with Dr. Hill, where he believes that everything comes from the brain and believes that there's many points where they butt heads about when will leaves the body, and that's kind of the sticking point between them, which
Right.
kind of echoes the text a little bit, for the like, and in a lot of ways, Herbert's reasoning and rational understanding of why he's doing these experiments and testing his reagent is very similar in both the movie and the book, in that both in the story and the movie, he really has very limited motivation. He's doing
Right.
it purely just because he can, just because he has
Right.
this reagent,
Right.
and he's trying to basically just record as much as he can about it. That,
Right.
like, how long does it take before the body reacts to it? What kind of thought comes out of it? Like, it's almost like a giddy excitement that he has whenever a
Yeah.
body reanimates, and he just wants to record and review everything that happens, no matter what happens, like a violent
Yeah.
outburst,
Yeah.
a rational thought, a like a fear response, like whatever happens, he's just gobbling it up
Yeah. He's
and
right
fascinated
there
by it.
making notes. Yep.
Which we talked briefly outside of the podcast about how that is a very 1920s, 1910s, like turn of the century scientific way of thinking, in
Well, and
that
I
it's
wouldn't even say
purely
that's
about,
relegated just to then. I'm sure there's scientists these days, with
sure,
that same kind of
absolutely,
drive and
but it's
you
that
know,
like almost medical detachment
yeah,
that 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 people had then that is kind of taboo now. A
right.
lot of people
Like the digging up
nowadays
of
would kind of,
bodies and
yeah,
stuff
like,
to
which
experiment
which
on.
again, like, is something they did in the tens,
Yeah,
which is more than likely where Lovecraft draws a lot of his inspiration for his original text from, is the idea
right,
that these medical students were body snatching from unmarked graves to basically test on, or using accident victims as test bodies. I mean, It's like if you have an organ donor symbol on your
Yeah.
ID, like someone's going to be churning through your insides once you die.
Oh yeah.
And uh, so I mean, it's stuff like that that we still have, but we don't really think about in terms of like the logic of it. But there's some kind of medical horror about the aspect of like if you die in an accident, like there will be someone who's going to be picking you apart.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting this because like you said, we don't know much about Herbert West before the movie starts. There's little to no background given to him at all.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't find out anything new in any of the movies. They do a really good job at keeping him. What you know about him is only what you see in the movie. There's no
Yeah, and
backstory,
from
there's
our
no nothing
protagonist
to it.
perspective, which in
Yeah,
the first two movies is Dan, and then in the
right,
third movie we have a new protagonist S character that perceives Herbert West in a different way.
right,
And um and that's really kind of core to a lot of Lovecraft's fiction is that usually we're in the perspective of an onlooker or
right,
someone who is perceiving the horrors around them. And that's kind of a really unique sense inside of even the film itself is that they kind of maintain that. They maintain the idea that we are viewers into this world of insanity that Herbert has concocted with his reagent.
right. Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting way to like, especially in this day and age where we want to know more about like what's his motivations, what's the backstory and all this. And I'm sure there's been stories. I know there's Re-Animator comic books and stuff, so maybe they've delved a little bit deeper
Oh,
into
sure.
like his past or whatever, and given him some kind of extra
Yeah,
story
we
to that.
meet Kid Herbert.
Yeah.
Figure out which
Um,
trauma led him down this terrible
right,
path.
but we
Well, and we
but
don't
yeah,
even
it's
know where the reagent comes from. Like we're introduced to the movie and the
yeah,
reagent is a thing. Like
it
we
already
don't like
exists, right?
there's no pomp and circumstance about the reagent itself. There's no like talk about like we need
Yeah,
these
where did it
chemicals
come
to
from? How
make
did
the
he come up with?
reagent.
Yeah,
Like we need to raid the chemical room to get access to these things. Like no, it's just that he has this reagent. He apparently has plenty of it or he can make a lot of it and he just needs bodies. He needs fresher and fresher subjects.
yeah, and it's just bizarre. But I like it. I like the fact that you're just plopped right down into the middle of the story, and you don't really need to know. That's what's great
Mm-hmm.
about it is we don't need to know. We're just full steam ahead. Mad scientist. Trying to
And
ropes his new roommate into
yeah,
helping him um and
well, and
fighting
that's
against
what's
the evil doctor at the hospital.
I
So
feel like a lot of movies that came out in the 80s really had this kind of sense of let's not spend too much of our time on exposition and let's just get right into the movie. Like you get things like Back to the Future where it's just like mad scientist
right,
created a time machine. How? We don't
right,
really need to know. Like it's just that he has this time machine and now we're into the movie.
right,
And you got aliens. Aliens just throws you in. You're in space. You're on this like weird space freighter. And
right,
like the thing, like suddenly we're seeing like a helicopter chasing down a dog. Like we don't know what's going on. Like there's no real exposition. It just kind of throws us into the action.
right,
And I think that it's something that's kind of unique about this time period of movies is that a lot of movies really just wanted to kind of like hook you right from the start. Like during the opening credits, like wanted you to be involved in the story, wanted to know what's going on. And this movie does that in spades because it immediately presents this situation where like there are police heading down this hallway and like there's like screaming and like people are like really concerned. And then you like they bash down the door and you see Herbert like hovering over like this old man with this needle and you're like, oh, what is
right,
going on? But that we don't know. He just says that it was an overdose, and that's all the information we give before it goes into the opening credits. which kind of sets the stakes, introduces the main character, and introduces a lot of the like central core ideas of the film that like that there's this green reagent, it does something and it kills people. So
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
I just think that that's a great sentiment that I think is missing in some modern movies.
Right. No, I think there's definitely movies that still do that, but definitely the 80s were a weird time where, I've been going back a lot and watching quite a few 80s movies as I've been um, you know, filling in gaps in my horror uh uh history. And so when I watch stuff, it's interesting to see movies. Some movies they'll give you a little prologue and get you up to speed and everything like that, but so many movies of the 80s just kind of ended and ended in weird ways that you're just like, okay,
Mhm.
I could have used a little bit more resolution
Sure.
to that, but these movies were just like, nope, it's done, we're done. And it's definitely something that I've noticed in storytelling in general, that at least in terms of movies and maybe comic books and stuff like that, that storytelling's gotten better in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
um that and you can see it with this even with this renaissance in television that we have nowadays, is that the storytelling just has gotten better. Not that the stories that were came before were bad, and I'm not saying that at all, just that we have a different way of telling stories now.
Sure.
So that when they can do it, when you watch something from the past that is different, is like the old way, but they do it well, you can appreciate that more. And I think that's Re-Animator does that really well as well, because when it ends on this note of, oh well, this isn't over, but
Hmm.
but it fades to black, and
Hmm.
but so
Well,
it's
that's actually indicative of even the source material
oh
because
yeah,
the way that they were written was they were written as very short stories that were included in a magazine, I believe.
oh right, right,
And the way that they end is oftentimes Lovecraft ended them with a cliffhanger,
right,
and
yeah, that makes sense.
um and they ended with like a single line of like let me see if I can find one. Oh yes, this one is actually my favorite. Help! Keep off, you cursed little towhead fiend! Keep that damned needle away from me! And that's the last line of one of the short stories. And so like that's where it would end. And then you would just flip the next page and it'd be someone else's horror story.
Right.
And so
You'd have to
so
wait for
it
next month for part
so
two.
it kind of makes sense. Like when the movie ends with Dan going over another person with the needle, and it just goes into the theme of the movie and cuts to credits. Like that's very Lovecraftian in terms
Right.
of how he was writing these stories. And so
Well,
and
and
we
like I
kind of get a
said, that
little bit
even,
of that even in the second one.
yeah, and that's, I mean, how it happens with love with Herbert Weston in at least these first two movies as well, is that he seemingly dies in both of the first two movies. We see
Yes, yeah.
what seems to be his death, but he manages to come back for another movie. So you're just like, and they don't
Which
explain it either, which is crazy. Like each one of these is just so funny that they don't, like, he seemingly dies, but they don't explain it in the next one. And so it just again starts
which
like,
which is also indicative of the source
yeah,
material in a way, because I can very much tell as I was reading them that Lovecraft, number one, I believe that it's on record that Lovecraft wasn't a huge fan of the Herbert West stories. He did them
right,
purely for monetary reasons, because people were really into Frankenstein, and so he was creating his own necromancer type character. And but for his stories, he uh I can tell he wrote them in such a way that he really did think that there was one story where this was the end, because it specifically says like and Herbert West was never seen again, and then the next story starts, and then it's a whole nother story of Herbert West, but before he disappeared.
that's
So
so funny.
So it's just
That's
kind of
interesting. I'm glad that that they held so well to the source material. Then that
no,
sounds
it was actually
yeah,
surprising to me because I actually read the story after I watched the movie, and
right,
so because I was interested to know more about the source material, and it's really impressive how much they were able to hold themselves to the source material while also updating it to allow for a larger, grander story to
right,
fit
and to
inside of a
bring
movie.
it to
Because
modern times
these,
as well.
yeah, and bring it into modern times, which is something that I think that more people doing cosmic horror, especially Lovecraft adaptations, need to do.
Right,
Because Lovecraft was writing for a particular audience. He was writing for people who lived in the 1910s, the 1920s,
right,
who were dealing with scientific discoveries and the kind of like fear and misunderstanding and the kind of nebulous nature of a lot of these things, because this was the
right,
kind of like renaissance of scientific thought. And and so it was scary. It was a complete new understanding of the world, and so people were creating new forms of science, some of them valid, some of them very not so. And and so he kind of explores a lot of those inside of his story. Uh and for Lovecraftian stories today, I really do think that they need to do this more, especially in like an example like Herbert West is bringing it into the modern context of the 80s, but having the same kind of like Victorian horror that Lovecraft has inside of his stories, but bringing it into the modern day.
right. Yeah, no, I think that's really cool. And I agree. I think that, if you're going to I don't think you have to bring it into the modern day. I mean, if you can tell a good story, a good adaptation of something like that and keep it in the original time period, fine, but
Yeah,
I am
there's
actually more interested in seeing somebody bring it into the modern day and making it work around that and trying to apply the same concepts to our modern era, because I think that would be more interesting in general, but also for most people, that
yeah,
you'd reach a much wider audience with that kind of aspect to it.
completely agree. I think that there's certain stories that work better as period pieces rather than
Yeah,
others. Like for example, I would find At the Mountains of Madness to be a little impractical to do inside of the modern era, just because that is a story of the technical limitations and dangers involved in exploring the Arctic in the
yeah,
20s. And they butt heads against their technology and their resources quite a lot inside of that, which in a more modern expedition to the Antarctic, which like while still challenging, there's a lot more things that we have technologically that would assist them. Also, it's
right,
a little less likely that they would get lost in the same ways that they get lost inside of that story, with things
yeah,
like
true,
GPS and like satellite imaging. And so certain stories like that, definitely. I think for like medical horror, like Herbert West, like I think it was very smart of him to bring it into the modern era. So that way it wasn't just like period pieces can turn off some viewers. And so I think
right,
that part
yeah,
of the reason why it's such a cult classic is because it wasn't a period piece. Because I think that there's a chance that it could have been disregarded if it was a period piece. Um,
right,
and it wouldn't have had the same relatability to the audiences that probably saw it at the time. Um, but real quick, I just want to go into specifically the first movie and kind of go into some of the things that actually stood out to me when reading,
yeah,
in terms of the similarities between the text, because I find that fascinating on just how closely they actually followed it.
right,
So Dr. Halsey is the dean of the Archimedical Institute inside of the story, and he is an antagonist to Herbert and his research. And while I don't believe we get a name to our protagonist. Our protagonist is our Dan character in
right,
terms of the novel. And basically, he goes along with Herbert just because he's fascinated by his research and like is fascinated by the fact that he has this reagent that is able to do this. But much like the movie, Herbert is constantly in search of a fresher corpse, something from an accident, something that hasn't had any damage, that it was a vigorous
Right.
body. And they do revive a muscular figure, and they wait a while and find that it takes a long time for him to actually reanimate, and then he attacks them, which is how one of the first stories ends. Um, and they basically have to flee their home. So instead of inside of the morgue, it happens inside of their home. And
Right.
so they have to flee, and then they don't know what happened to that one.
Oh
That
wow.
one just kind of
Okay.
escapes. There's reports of like claws on a loose grave, like in the local newspaper afterward, but it just escapes. And so Herbert has this kind of like looming dread over his shoulder of like this thing finding him again. Um, so very Frankenstein, like just having his monster escape. And then the next one is when Dr. Halsey actually dies. And I believe that Halsey dies kind of very like altruistically.
All
He
right.
isn't murdered. He kind of has his heart fail while having to take care of a lot of people in a very like intense medical situation. And but Herbert gets his hands on his body, and in a weird like kind of slight, like it's not explicitly said inside of the text, but in a weird way of like revenge almost on him for limiting his research, he does inject him with the reagent to reanimate him. And like inside of the movie, Dr. Halsey goes insane and is locked
Right.
up, and put inside of an asylum. And so and that's where he basically stays for 16 years.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and yeah, no, it's a really long period of time. And then we That's pretty much where it ends in terms of the similarities to the first few stories. But one thing I want to point out though is that there's a character that's introduced later on inside of the short stories known as Major Sir Eric Moreland Clapham Lee, DSO, which was someone who, yeah, very long name, um,
Yeah.
uh, who was introduced inside of the chapters about the Great War, which is somewhat picked up on inside of the second movie, but contextualized inside of the 80s rather than the 1910s. And uh, he essentially fills the Dr. Hill role, in terms of the novels, or not novels, but the short stories, because his head is lopped off, and they inject the body with the serum, and then the head independently reanimates without being injected. Um,
Interesting.
and and uh, and they essentially lose him, like they lose the body and the head, and then the head and the body comes back later on, with the fact that this body knows Herbert's research and is able to bring people back from the dead and build a undead army in the same way that Dr. Hill does inside of the first movie. And he even travels around with a wax head on his shoulders. And he carries his head to his side. So very much like Dr. Hill
Yeah.
inside of the first movie. And so it's really interesting how they kind of took a lot of the things from
Right.
the Lovecraft narrative, but built an actual movie around it by adding this antagonist of Dr. Hill inside of the first movie, rather than having an incredibly long name. They truncated it down to Dr. Hill,
Right.
which actually not a doctor, but there is a character called Ronald Hill, that is mentioned inside of one of the books, which I actually don't know what the first name of Dr. Hill is, which would be kind of interesting if it is Ronald Hill, if they just kind of took another name
It's
from.
Carl in the movie.
Oh, it's Carl. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I found that really interesting that that's how they kind of married it together. And then
Right.
in regards to the second movie kind of picks up the like core narrative in terms of chronologically, as Lovecraft even put them out, regarding the future of Herbert, especially after he fights, not fights, but serves during some conflict and uses the conflict's surplus of bodies that comes into his medical tent as basically free test subjects.
Oh, okay.
And so,
Interesting.
but I'm assuming you might have some more to talk about the first one, before we hop on to the second one.
I just wanted to talk about the performances really. It's I really enjoy Jeffrey Combs in this. It's one of the I wasn't super familiar with any of his work. I'm sure I'd seen him in other things before I saw him in this, and I only saw these movies recently, in the last few years, for the first time. So I'm sure I've seen him in other things, because I know he's been around for quite a bit. And but I really enjoyed his performance in this, like we mentioned
Yeah.
before, that detached kind of mad scientist that he is,
Yeah,
and that
he really delivered in this movie
yeah,
on the idea that he was this cold, purely scientific person that had no ethical or moral philosophy that was being compromised by anything that he was doing, and that he was
right,
doing it purely from the rational perspective.
yeah, and and I just he brings a lot of that comedy and stuff to it, that just because of that kind of heightened kind of madness that he has in there. I one of the my favorite lines, and apparently it's a favorite line of a lot of people, is the who's going to believe a talking head? Get a job in a sideshow. Um, and I just love uh that line because it's a great delivery, and it's just such a bizarre um thing to say. I mean, obviously the whole scenario is bizarre because he is talking to a guy who's holding his head in his hand. Um, so
Yeah, no, I mean
it's
it
just a fun
really
line.
it really brought a lot of brevity to that sequence. And yeah, I mean it's like don't get me wrong, it's an intense movie. There's gore, there's great effects, there's great practical effects. That's something we really haven't talked about just yet, but the practical effects inside of
Yeah,
the movie are fantastic. It helps the movie stand the test of time, and really keeps it really keeps it from looking too aged. Uh,
right.
Especially I can't remember for Beyond Reanimator if there's too much CGI that's used, but I think that there's a little bit that's used that kind of
Yeah,
dates
Beyond
it.
Reanimator has a little bit more, yeah, for sure, because
Yeah,
it's a '90s movie, so that's
yeah,
when
and
they
so,
started using CG a lot more.
but yeah, um, yeah, I, I just really, I really appreciate when, and we discussed this a little bit before too, about how for 80s movies, because there really wasn't access to CGI in the same ways that it is today, that everything just has that visceral quality to it, because they really had to figure out, like, okay, what can we get at the grocery store to make it look how we want it to look?
Right.
And there's just so much unbound creativity with a lot of like the miniature work, the effects work, and a lot of the other stuff that goes into a lot of these older movies in terms of how they were able to pull off a lot of these shots that otherwise would have been impossible with the technology and the limitations of filmmaking inside of the 80s. And and so for me, I think that they did a fantastic job on this first one. Like I personally, for me, like I think it's just a great film. I think
Oh
that they
yeah.
just made a fantastic film. Like I can't think of anything particularly damning in it, beyond I can't remember her name, but her perform the girlfriend's girl Dan's girlfriend inside of the film has some pretty brutal acting at some of the points in the film. But I'm understanding that she becomes a scream queen later on, and I'm sure that this is one of her earlier roles,
Oh
and so
yeah.
I'm sure
Yeah, no,
she
it's
figures that out.
well,
Um,
she'd been on soap operas before this as well, so her acting may her most of her acting may, and again, part of it I think was soap opera experience, but also part of it is um the text, the script, and part of it's
mhm.
the theatricality of it all. Again, Stuart Gordon comes from this theater background, so his direction's probably going to be more of, make it bigger, make it,
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know, so um, but yeah, Barbara Crampton, she played Megan, and she, she's definitely a huge person in horror. This was, I think, one of, if not her first um, big horror role. And she goes on to do quite a few horror movies after this. And she took some time off, to be with her family, and then has come roaring back, even more so now, where she's actually a major producer, helping smaller movies get made. So, which is really cool. She's such a big proponent for horror movies, and I love to see actors um, who don't shy away from that. People who got their start. There's so many actors who got their starts in horror movies who, after just a couple of, like, kind of turned their back on it. And I get it. Maybe that wasn't something you were really interested in, but I love the actors who love the genre and who come back and, like, are just like, okay, yes, let's do everything we can to, keep moving horror forward and take it to interesting places and stuff. So I really like Barbara Crampton for that, because not only is she's actually a really good actress, but she's such a huge part of the horror community in general. So
Yeah.
um
And
but yeah.
her character is very central to the plot in the
Oh yeah.
second film.
To a degree, even though she's not
At least her
in the
heart is.
movie at all. Yeah. Yeah, her heart's in the right place.
Yes.
um
Or is it?
yeah. But yeah, no, that's what is interesting. Like, I guess they did ask her to, or I guess they were going to have her back, but then her manager told her not to, because he didn't want her getting
Oh.
typecast into horror. And so
Well,
and then eventually,
did a bad
that's
job.
what she, yeah. Yeah. So, but I like that, and she's really big about, even with uh yeah, I mean, because she goes on to star in another Stuart Gordon HP Lovecraft movie. She does From Beyond with Jeffrey Combs again,
Hmm.
and then they go on to do another one, Castle Freak. All three of them are together again for that one as well. So, I mean, she obviously enjoyed
Yeah.
working with them, and has had a good time doing it. So it's good. Obviously, not doing Bride of Re-Animator was, it's whatever, but uh yeah, it's I just think she's a great actress. It's really cool. But yeah, let's go ahead and move on into Bride of Reanimator, since we're talking about it. This one moves ahead um a little bit. I'm not sure
Yeah, a few
exactly.
years.
Yeah. And Dan and Herbert West are together, and they're in some war torn area, and basically using the corpses. They're there as doctors, but of course Herbert West is using the corpses as experiments
Mhm.
for his reagent.
But now,
So
but now the new thing that's introduced inside of this movie is that now Herbert is using reptilian regeneration as part of the serum,
right, yes,
and that there's some aspect of utilizing reptiles' natural ability to regenerate their body parts in order to independently uh,
correct.
independently reanimate not whole bodies, but
But
just
just
body
body
parts.
parts. Yes.
As well as a somewhat sickening fascination of attaching human body parts to animals, or animal body parts to animal or to humans.
Two humans, yeah.
Um, and so there's a lot of kind of shenaniganery that occurs inside of this movie.
Right. Because this one is actually directed by Brian Usna, who's most well known for probably most well known to people for directing the 1980s movie Society, which is a pretty gross and goofy body horror movie. Brian Usna is obviously, you look at his filmography and he's a pretty big fan of body horror. So this one leans more into body horror than The first movie does.
Certainly.
Um, and yeah, so this one's interesting because of those aspects. Um, this one utilizes a little bit more. I don't think it's computer generation. I think they're using stop motion animation. Um,
Yeah, no, it feels a little
or,
more like the thing in a way, like the way that things move is a little jerky.
right. Well, I think
Um,
that's stop motion. So,
yeah.
but yeah, it's this one, like all these movies, like I said, all these movies are good. This one's less good than the first one for me. I think it's still interesting in a lot of ways, but um they definitely um this one's definitely doing something different, because Dan is now obsessed with this. Dan is obsessed with reanimating Megan, because she died after the first, or died at the end of the first movie.
Yeah.
And so, but they've saved her heart, and they're waiting for like a good donor to put it into. And But that's kind of what they're doing. They're actually kind of, this time, this one's more Frankenstein, because they're actually
Yes.
building a body out of all these different body parts, that they're scavenging basically. And um that they're going to eventually put Megan's heart into, um to kind of recreate her. That's the whole,
Yeah,
that
the
at
the
least
idea being
that's what
based
Herbert
on
West wants to do.
Based on Herbert's interpretation, because Herbert essentially is now under the assumption that because now he can reanimate entire body, like only body parts, that means that the will is not even in the brain or anywhere at all. Because in the first movie,
Right.
they were applying it to the brainstem. So they were
Right.
still applying it to the brain in a way. And so there was still this idea that the brain was the source of life. But with this one, it is expressly determined that the will is in whatever body part you want it to be in.
Right.
And so they kind of put it so with this, the idea is that somehow Megan's consciousness remains in her heart, and it's somewhat symbolic of the idea that if you put Megan's heart inside of a new body, it would still be the same Megan, but it would be inside of some new amalgam.
Right.
And this is where things just go far afield of Lovecraft's original writing.
Right.
Because number one, Megan was not even in the story to begin with, and so there's no love interest that's ever introduced inside of the short stories.
Okay.
And so this one, it really dives deep into the idea of this love interest and the bride of reanimator aspect of it. I'm definitely leaning into like, okay, how do we make this more like Frankenstein, where we like lean a little heavier into the hammer horrorness of this. And but with that said, though, there is a few things that actually stay true to the text. Some of them include the fact that Herbert uses reptile regeneration as a
Interesting.
method to animate individual body parts. That is a part of the original text. That is how he figures out how to do it. In terms of when he creates the headless antagonist against him, that eventually leads into the ending of this film, which actually almost directly mirrors the ending of the actual short story series. Um, is that he places the head of Sir Clapham Lee inside of a vat of these like reptilian cells. And that's what makes it even more horrifying is that he didn't even inject him with the serum. He just injects the body with it. And then inside of the vat comes the voice of Clapham Lee, as the building around them collapses. And
Hmm.
so kind of an interesting twist on that, in a way. And
Yeah.
but in regards to that, moving on from that, we inside of this movie we see the return of Dr. Hill. In the first movie, his head's totally squashed, like total like pancake.
Yeah.
And we do see inside of this movie that like I actually do believe he submerges his head at one point inside of the reagent, and that's how he heals. So there is, or maybe it's even the reptilian cells. I can't actually remember, so there might be actually something about that inside of the
Right.
film, about trying to mimic that from the original text. And he regenerates, and then now Dr. Hill's back, and he wants to kill Herbert West. Um,
Right.
and he goes in her. So Hill's head is in the possession of like the morgue operator inside of the Miskatonic University, and there's a whole exchange between them where Hill psychically controls him to create more bodies as well as more reagents, so that way he can basically attack attack Herbert. Meanwhile, Herbert and Dan are just in the process of just collecting body parts in order to create Dan's new Megan, like new love interest. Whereas with Herbert, he's just doing it for the hell of it. Like I couldn't really
Right.
tell what his like motivation was beyond just like almost trying to make Dan happy.
I
It
think it's more about keeping Dan on his side. He's
yes,
constantly,
yeah.
even in
Like he
both
needs an
these first new
assistant.
movies, he needs an assistant, and Dan is, if he can keep Dan there by this promise of recreating Meg for him or whatever, then that's
Mm-hmm.
what he'll do. So he's just, yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
no, it gives
horrible.
Dan a little
Yeah.
more agency in the film versus the main character inside of the short stories. He's just kind of with Herbert because he's
Yeah.
with him. Like they're
Yeah.
beyond the scientific nature of everything. The main character really doesn't have any motivation along with
Right.
Herbert.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so this one, if it seems like we're talking about this one less, it's because it's a lot shorter. It's a very
Yeah.
short film,
Well,
and
it's not just
and
that, but this one's just, again, I like these movies, but this one doesn't have a whole lot to it because, I mean, again, he's fighting Dr. Hill. Now, don't get me
mhm.
wrong, Dr. Hill has bat wings on his head now, so he's able to fly around, which is fun and goofy and everything. But
Oh yeah,
it takes a while for that to happen,
a,
and
a
then
little a
it's
little
only
less a little less than I would have wanted. I would have wanted a little more Bat Dr. Hill
yeah.
because I loved the goofiness of it.
But yeah, but overall, I think that this one just, it doesn't hold together as well as the first one.
Yeah, and there's
Um,
also this kind of subplot to this film where there's this police officer who had his
oh yeah,
wife reanimated by Herbert after she
right,
died, and now she's locked inside of an insane asylum along with some of Herbert's other test subjects that have been
right,
caught and gathered up because people think that they've just gone insane rather
right,
than
right,
believing them to be corpses. And so there's this whole kind of subplot about that where the cop just basically wants to kill Herbert and find out
right.
if he was the one responsible. And
Yeah,
um
and that
which
subplot is just like, I that one just,
yeah.
it's
Yeah,
not fun.
it felt
So
like
it kind of
it was a
grinds
way
it
to
down a little bit.
pad the time on the movie
Right. Yeah.
on a already very short movie. And so
Right.
it felt weird to just have this like secondary plot on top of everything. And then also Dan has like a new girlfriend that he met during the war that
Well,
that is
it's
basically
not.
trying to
Yeah,
basically
it's a new
she's this
love
like
interest of sorts. Yeah.
she's basically trying to like it's basically a challenge. So Dan is working to build this bride with
Right.
Megan's heart, his old girlfriend's heart, while he's also with this new girl, Francesca, who is basically trying to pull him away from Herbert by saying like he's
Right.
dangerous and you don't know what he's doing. And but Dan is too hyper focused on the possibility of having Megan come back, which kind of comes to a head at the very end where
Right.
the bride awakens after getting the reagent injected. Actually, I believe through her entire circulatory system. I think was the
Yeah.
whole gimmick of it was that the idea
Right.
had
Well,
to be
yeah,
that
because it
it
would
had to
have
go
to be
through
all
every
of the
body
parts.
part.
Yeah.
And so they
Well,
basically
and it may
recreate
have been
like a whole
injected
like
right into the
circulatory
heart.
system. Yes, yeah. And so it creates this whole circulatory system that then awakens the bride, who is this very like bride of Frankenstein, just like very distant, eyes wide open, like
Yeah.
talking with a mouth open in whispers. Very like very hammer horror in
Yeah.
the way that it was presented. And but basically Dan's like, oh, you're not my girlfriend. I'm gonna go with this girl named Francesca. And then girl gets mad, and then she starts tearing herself apart,
Rips
and
her heart
because she
out.
can't
Yeah.
live with the fact that she was rejected by Dan in her like mutated reagent form. Meanwhile,
Right.
Herbert's got his own problems because Dr. Hill's back and he has reanimated a lot of corpses, and they have moved into a brand new house that is right next to a tomb,
Yeah.
which has provided Herbert with a lot of useful
Uh,
bodies for his
usable body parts. Yeah.
yeah, useful body parts for his research, but it has also created a problem for him because now it's just a gateway to getting into his house to kill him. And
Right.
which, in regards to the actual story, the final chapter of the Re-Animator series is actually called Tomb Legions, and specifically deals with the fact that Sir Clapham Lee um, goes to the Miskatonic morgue, reanimates a couple servants, then mails his head to Herbert, which is what happens inside of
Yeah,
the
which
movie.
happens in the movie. Yeah.
And Herbert opens it up and sees the head uh of Clapham Lee, and Clapham Lee basically gives him an ultimatum about how he's going to die, and Herbert rejects it, throws it down, and runs to the basement, but finds that the masonry on the side of the wall is being torn away by the tomb legions, and basically a bunch of undead walk in single file, and Herbert inside of the short story actually kind of just accepts it. He just kind of like stands still with no fear on his face and just accepts the reality of his creations destroying him, knowing
Right.
knowing full well that the horrors that he's created. And actually inside of the short story, it is very explicit that he's dead because
Yeah.
there's a description of him being torn apart by these creatures.
Right.
And then the house collapses on them, which is exactly what happens inside of the movie as well, is that these
Right.
zombies break through right after Dan rejects his zombie bride, and they attack and they try to flee, but Herbert, Dan, and Francesca are all crushed by the house. But then it's revealed at the end of the film that Dan and Francesca get away, which inside of the actual novel or the short story, keep saying novel. Um, inside of the short story, the main character does get away, and he was within the room at the time that the legions consume Herbert. And so, like, very like in terms of, I am very surprised that between the journey from Stuart Gordon to Brian Usna, the authenticity to the original narrative that they held in regards to Herbert West's story, like Lovecraft's original story. And I I think that Stuart Gordon was very wise in his use of taking things from the later chapters of the narrative and bringing them into
Right.
the first film, whereas I feel that it ended up leaving Brian Usna with not a whole lot
Right.
to actually pull from. And so he ended up really pulling from the last like three chapters of the narrative and having to kind of pull in all of this like information about like the reptile tissue, the war, the fact that like Dr. Hill, it comes back, like the headless doctor comes back to wreak havoc on Herbert, and having the idea of these like undead breaking through like a cemetery wall. And so
Right.
like there was enough there for him to kind of do something with, but I feel like he felt like he had to fill it in somehow, and so he created this whole like Bride of Re-Animator narrative to kind of bridge it even closer to Frankenstein, which some things work, some things don't. Personally,
Right.
for me, I think the movie was strongest whenever we just saw Herbert just toying around with the
Right.
reagent and just creating his like horrible like animal human abominations that he was creating. Like I think he put like an ear. No, he put like a hand on some. I can't remember what it
He
was.
put he connected fingers, just fingers, not even hands, just connected fingers to each other with an
Right.
eyeball.
Yes,
and
yes, he created a little
and
eyeball
Rhiannon.
spider, and then he also, I
Yeah,
believe, attached an arm to a foot, like an arm and a leg.
yeah,
And then it ended up kicking him and choking him.
yeah, yeah,
Um, this one really kind of leaned a little more into the Evil Dead kind of humor
yeah,
aspect of it. And this one was definitely more. It felt to me more comedy than horror, versus the
yeah.
first one that I felt was more horror than comedy. And so it kind of it bridges the gap well, and I believe it does give. I can't remember any fantastic one-liners for Herbert,
Right.
but I believe it gives him a couple. I think there's a
Yeah.
couple in the second one that they give him, and so it does feel like a worthy sequel, but it doesn't hold up to the same level of quality that the first
Right.
one delivered, and
Yeah.
that's kind of a disappointment. Um, but I will give it props for staying true to the source material.
Well, an interesting thing here is that the cop's name in this was Lieutenant Leslie Chapham. So,
Oh, okay.
so yeah. So
All
again,
right.
holding a little closer to
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And Francesco is played by somebody you'll recognize if you hadn't already, but you won't recognize her by name. But she was played by Fabiana Udinio.
hmm
For
She was a lot of vagina in Austin
yes,
Powers.
yes. So
I I recognized her
did you
immediately.
did you?
Yeah.
Okay. 80s fans will recognize her from the movie Summer School as well. She was in that. She was the foreign exchange student in that. Um, so it's a
Body horror in Austin Powers. I am a mixed
yeah.
bag.
Oh yeah, very mixed bag. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think this movie is it borders on the silly at times, and I think that the comedy, whereas we said, the first one's more horror than comedy, but the comedy helps punctuate it in ways. This one is almost a little too silly, and it
Mhm.
kind of undermines it in ways that the first movie doesn't get undermined.
I would still
So
say it's worth a watch,
no, it's definitely worth a watch.
especially
I
if you
still enjoy it.
enjoyed the first Reanimator. I think that if
Yeah,
you're looking for a fun, goofy sequel to it,
yeah.
it's definitely worth a watch.
And this one
It is
came out
by
in
no means
91,
a Silent
so
Night, Deadly Night 2. It is actually it's way like in comparison, it is way better,
right.
honestly, which
Yeah,
is kind of surprising to say.
yeah.
But it I guess it's not a high bar.
No,
But it for a horror sequel done by a different director, continuing a narrative that like was left on somewhat of a cliffhanger, but didn't necessarily need a sequel. I would say that it's
right.
a worthy watch. Like it's definitely worth
Yeah.
watching.
Oh yeah. I would agree. But yeah, that brings us to Beyond Reanimator, which
And
came
this is
out
the point where I close the book
yes, because
because
it literally is Beyond Reanimator.
there's
Um
nothing in the original text about what happens in this movie.
so whereas the original Reanimator came out in 1985, Bride of Reanimator came out in 1991. But I believe Bride of Reanimator was actually filmed in 89. Yeah.
It definitely
Yeah.
feels like a
Film
movie that was filmed in the 80s.
yeah. So it was filmed in 89, but didn't come out till 91. Um um
The
yeah,
public
so
wasn't ready
I
for it.
yeah. Um
For a hard hitting horror movie like Bride of
yeah, and
Reanimator.
then so then Beyond Reanimator came out in 2003, and Beyond Reanimator was part of this new kind of studio thing where there was this Spanish production company that Brian Usna was a part of, that they made like five or six movies. One of them was Beyond Reanimator, another one was Dagon, and there were a couple more. Um, and Dagon was another Lovecraft movie done by Stuart Gordon. Um, so he was definitely a fan of
Keeping up appearances.
Lovecraft. But yeah, so this one, Beyond Reanimator, like I said, 2003. This one is again directed by Brian Usna. The only person to return for this one is Jeffrey Combs. No Dan this time. Nobody else. No Dr. Hill. Uh, and
Dan is
it's
finally done with Herbert
yeah,
shenanigans.
yeah, yes. And this time we get a new assistant of sorts, but this time Herbert's in jail. He's been incarcerated for the events of
I can't
uh,
imagine why.
the yeah. So he's been incarcerated supposedly for the events that happened in the first two movies. And you get a
Tax
little
evasion.
prologue. You get a little prologue of what happened. There was like a kid and his sister, and they were attacked by one of the reanimated. The sister dies. Herbert West is arrested. And then the kid, um, sees a vial or a syringe of reagent on the ground, and as Herbert is being pulled away, and then it's a few years later, and now this kid is now an adult, and he's being transferred into this prison that Herbert West is at, and he's becoming the new doctor of the prison.
Mhm.
They try
Which
really hard to present this prison as like an American prison, but it is so obvious this is a Spanish production because all of the actors are Spanish and they're overdubbed with American accents and everything. So
Yeah.
it's a little weird and off-putting.
Well,
So
and one thing that I find interesting about the idea of the film, because I think that there's a moment in the film that almost implies that he's not the doctor that was actually supposed to be assigned there. I
yeah,
might be imagining that, but I think I remember a moment where there's a kind of a throwaway line that he almost kind of forced his way in so that way he could see Herbert,
right.
and he's almost impersonating. I believe I might be wrong about that, but I think that there's an essence of an idea
I
that he's impersonating.
think that's supposed to be the idea. Yeah, I don't know if
Uh,
like he just forged something or something. Yeah,
yeah. Um, and
but yeah.
and so yeah, so just to establish some characters so that way we can begin our discussion. This one, we have our son of Reanimator, if you will, that's
Right.
introduced is the doctor that comes in to see Herbert because of his childhood trauma of having his sister be killed by one of his creations. And then we also have this like news reporter woman who's at the prison
Yeah, she's doing like a story on the
because,
prison. Yeah.
yeah, she's just kind of there doing a story on the prison, just happened to be there.
I think
Um,
she's just meant to be the new female co-lead, because we've
yeah,
had
yeah.
them through each one of them so far. Interesting aside, real quick. This actress is Elsa Pataki, who goes on to be in some of the Fast and the Furious franchise. She plays the oh man, I don't remember her name now, but she's the Brazilian cop in Fast Five that Dominic ends up having a relationship and a kid with.
mm,
And also, she is Chris Hemsworth's real life wife.
mm,
So, yeah,
um, yeah, she's she's definitely the love interest of the film. She's introduced as this kind of
like almost like an investigative reporter.
yeah,
Yeah,
investigative reporter who's kind of trying to get in the scoop on the prison. And but then we also get our villain, our Dr. Hill, if you will, of this movie because we don't have a Dr. Hill. Dr. Hill doesn't come back for this one. But we get the warden, who is the villain of this story, who's kind of this like sexual harasser of this reporter, and so where you immediately don't like this guy, as he is kind of coming on to the reporter, and the reporter's just trying to do
right.
her job. But the reporter and our son of Reanimator, they both kind of hit it off, and they have their own relationship that begins. So our new Dan has a new Megan, so that way we can keep that going. And but the again new thing. So last time it was reptilian cells were the key to regeneration.
Right.
Now it's electroplasmic neurons or something like that. It's
Right.
basically Herbert walks around with these like little vacuum tubes that whenever he kills something with electricity, he kind of captures their neuron essence in a way. Like it's kind of vague. Like there's a little bit of
Right.
like almost an attempt to be kind of poetic about it, where it's like, is it their soul or is it not their soul? Is it just like a
Right.
scientific
Yeah.
thing?
Yeah.
And
It's like a
basically,
bioelectricity.
yeah, and he kind of traps it inside of these little light bulbs, and then when at the moment of reanimation, that's when you're supposed to jab this light bulb into the body, and it discharges this like soul-like energy into whatever body it is, and it gains the consciousness or behavior of whatever it came from.
Right.
So
Yeah.
this establishes some tension in the movie about how Herbert kills the pet rat of another one of the prisoners to take its essence. And Herbert still has his kind of cold, distant scientific attachment to everything. And so he just doesn't care. Like he doesn't care that all
Right.
these prisoners are about to beat him up. And so he just kind of goes on with everything. And then eventually our character meets up with the son of Re-Animator, and they start doing their experimentation
Son
on
of Re-Animator.
um it's what how I felt about it. Um
Right. No,
and they kind
this one's definitely it's a marked difference between the Dan character in the first two movies, and in this one,
yes.
this guy's just going along with whatever. He's
Yeah,
full
there's
on
no
like his assistant the whole time,
yeah,
helping him
like
do everything, whatever he wants to do, he does it for him.
yeah, which
So
is why it feels more like a son of Re-Animator, because
right,
there is no agency to this character beyond his relationship with the reporter
right,
character. And so basically they like a couple of the prisoners die due to like health circumstances, and so they apply this new method of regeneration onto them, and it causes them to like react in horrid ways by putting like rat energy inside of a person, and so that makes them act like a rat, and makes them a little more violent. um, and so eventually it kind of all comes to a head when the warden kills the reporter character
right.
for rejecting his advances, and then that's kind of the catalyst that moves us towards our climax. Because now of course son of Re-Animator wants to revive the reporter and wants to
Right.
revive her in the right way, and so I actually can't remember where they get the neurons for her. It's the warden, I think, actually. Because that's kind of
Could
the
be,
whole
yeah.
thing later on, is that they kind of share a body for a bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, because the warden's a pretty messed up dude. Like the warden
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
this is like kind of a murderous rampager.
Yeah, he doesn't
It
care
seems.
that people are dying, and he's actively killing some of the prisoners as
Yeah,
well.
I mean, hell, he kills a reporter for rejecting his advances. And
Right.
so I mean, he's not the best guy. And so when they take his essence and then put it inside of her, when they reanimate her, it causes her to come back, and she has some of her consciousness, but she also has the bridged consciousness of the warden, and so she has this split personality where now she's surprisingly violent at times, but then she kind of wakes up from it, almost like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation, where she wakes up from it and is kind of horrified at what she's done. And then beyond that, because the warden is dead, Herbert, in his vast levels of hubris, puts the reagent inside of him, as well as the rat essence that he's had
Right.
for a while, and creates the rat warden, which
Right.
is it's this own like kind of murderous, dangerous character that ends up basically sending the entire prison into some form of chaos, where like there's a whole climax where there's a big prison break, everything's on fire, people are running around killing each other. The people
Right.
who are mad at Herbert for killing the rat are coming after him. They're also coming after the reporter lady because they're also sexual harassers. and they're coming after her. Basically, lots of death, lots of destruction. End of the movie, war like it kind of goes to chaos into the
Yeah,
third third half sorry third of the movie
right.
and so things kind of get convoluted after a little bit. Oh, I for like this movie is all over the place. There's one
Yeah,
point where one guy injects the serum into him while he's alive, and it causes him to have
yeah,
like a convulsion. And
yeah.
then it kind of calls back to the first movie in a way, in the idea that an overdose causes your body to explode.
Right, right.
Which actually that is how they killed Dr. Hill in the first one. I forgot that. I forgot that that's how they killed Dr.
Yeah,
Hill
they
in the
kill the
first
body
movies. They
part,
kill him with the
the
overdose.
main body. Yeah.
And so basically he overdoses and then the guy's body explodes. And then like of course there's a funny scene where his skeleton's like, oh, I want another hit, man. So
Yeah.
because like all semblance of seriousness is gone
Oh
by
yeah.
this
No, this
film.
one's definitely a full tilt silly movie. It's just he's definitely leaning more into the comedy, not even necessarily the comedy, but literally the silliness of everything. I mean, we got the rat warden, we got the junkie who's just like injecting himself with it, and even
And
though
when
he's like
we
melting, that he's
for those who have
he's
not
asking
seen
for
the
more of it.
film, when we say rat warden, like we're talking full on like arms up to
Big
the chest,
ears,
big
his
ears, like
nose has come out.
his
Yeah,
nose is coming
rat
out and
teeth.
his teeth are like elongating in the
Yeah,
front. Like he's full on like transformation to his
yeah.
entire body, not just acting like a rat.
Well, I
Um,
did want to mention too, though, that you keep calling him son of Re-Animator, but his name in the movie is Dr. Howard Phillips. So I mean, he's
sure, but we
he's
don't need
yeah.
to worry about his actual name.
Well, of course, because it's Howard Phillips Lovecraft. So it's an homage to that. It's
Yeah, yeah.
a way to pull him into that. But yeah, no, this movie's just really silly. I again, this one's definitely the lesser of the three. And I still like it because it is goofy and weird. And it continues the overall story. But it's definitely not as good as even the second one is. And it's it's just because it's all over the place. It's kind of a very thin story. Um, and generally speaking, the performance are just kind of um it's just too silly. It's for me anyway. It was it was fun, but it was just a little too goofy for me.
Hmm.
And I think it just kind of drags. It actually makes the movie drag a bit. Makes it
Yeah.
feel longer than it is. Um, so
Well,
yeah.
and I honestly, I mean, I watched that one last, and it's actually surprisingly the most forgettable movie of the three. Like, I really can't. I honestly can't remember a whole lot beyond a couple of like the more important details about it. Like I can even remember. I can't remember how the reporter's character resolves. I know the rat warden gets electrocuted in an electric chair, and then I can't remember how she gets resolved. And then I believe Howard gets pulled out by the police, but Herbert gets away
Herbert escapes. Yeah.
because he steals the identification of Howard
Of
as the
Howard. Yeah.
medical
But
doctor.
this is the
Um,
only one where how like where West escapes and he's alive at the end. Like each of
yeah,
the previous two installments, he dies.
yeah.
So it's
Which
it's
is a
bizarre.
bold move after a wild, ridiculous movie to
Yeah.
to leave it
To
open
not
for
kill
a
him off. Yeah.
sequel
Yeah.
and just be like, yeah, people are gonna want more of this.
I don't even
And
know if it was necessarily that, but they were just like, okay, well, this one we're gonna let him live. We killed him off in the last two. We might as well let him live in this one.
yeah, and so I
So
mean, it was like I don't even know if I can say it was fun. It was it, it
it's
was it was definitely something.
it's
It,
not boring, and
no.
that's what I'll say. It's not boring. It's I wouldn't say it's necessarily fun. It's goofy and weird. And you can have some enjoyment in it, especially just going into it knowing that, and
Hmm.
knowing that it's not going to be as good as the first one is at all, and just enjoy it for what it is. It's just more Herbert West, and as
Yeah.
long as you
Yeah.
can go into it knowing that, then you're good.
If you're bought in already and you already watched the first two and you're like, man, I want to know what happens next, then
Exactly.
you can watch this one. I would be very surprised if this one leaves you wanting more. I feel
Right.
like any desire that I had wanting more after the second one was ceremoniously murdered with this movie. Um,
Right.
just because, and it's not even necessarily because of just like how bad it is. It's just that it it didn't like it just seems like such a departure. Like there's a certain element of it that just feels so against the feel and the themes of the first two movies inside of this one, that it just kind of feels like they were kind of trying to jump the shark in a way, like they were just trying
Right.
to progress the narrative in an interesting way by having be like, well, what if you had like a little light bulb, you put the
Right.
light bulb in the body and like created a soul, which again, not a terrible idea. Like it's very mad
No.
scientist, it definitely fits within the Lovecraftian kind of mythos of like weird like pseudo magic technology.
Right.
um and so like I was actually fine with that. That just everything surrounding that idea is the stuff
Right.
that kind of makes the movie fall apart. Like even the idea of Herbert inside of a prison isn't a terrible idea. Like that
No.
is a kind of unique aspect of like, yeah, I'm sure there would be bodies in a prison that like come in and every now and again that provide him subjects.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and so I think that it's definitely a unique sense of it. I just think that the framed narrative of the evil warden and the reporter and everything else just kind of made everything kind of fall apart. Um, and yeah, so I mean, I where I said that the second one was worth a watch, Beyond Reanimator really is only if you want to like be a
Yeah, only if you want
completionist.
to. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I would say only watch it if you're really like interested in completing the saga, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and even then, you can really not watch it and be okay.
Yeah,
So,
there wasn't anything that I feel about Beyond Reanimator is like, oh, you gotta at least see this. Like there isn't even
right,
anything like clip worthy inside of the movie. Like there isn't something where I'd
right,
be like, hey, look up this clip. Like there really isn't anything. I mean, like you at least got Garbage Day out of Silent Night. But
right.
like you don't there really isn't a Garbage Day moment inside of this movie. It's just bad. It's just a bad movie. Um and it's yeah, it's just I really don't even think it's bad due to the acting, because I mean Jeffrey Combs still brings his like unique acting to Herbert in this. It
Right.
still feels like Herbert from him. It's just that a lot of the writing around him is just not great. Um,
Yeah.
so I mean, if you like the character of Herbert West, then I would say that watch this. Like, watch it if you want to just see more of Jeffrey Combs being Herbert West, because he does a fantastic job. Jeffrey
Yeah.
Combs delivers on his interpretation of Herbert West again. Uh, as for the other characters and just the rest of the narrative, it just I don't know, it just wasn't for me. It didn't for me. The Batwing Doctor Hill felt more in line with the
Right.
movie than anything in this one.
Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
uh, it just kind of was like, oh, he's in prison. What can we do? Well, like let's have like a mean prisoner guy who wants to hurt him for killing his pet rat. it's
Right.
like it's like okay. Also, let's have like a weirdly religious, like really religious, like albino character that is supposed to be horrifying as like the first reanimated corpse.
Right.
And so just like stuff like that just feels like really weird where it felt like they were kind of in a room just figuring out like, okay, like what could we do in a prison? Um, and so, but in any case, uh, I think that overall the trilogy of movies is strongest when you watch it as a duology. I think that the first and the second one watched together can be a fun movie night. If you're looking to engage just purely from the like, you just want to know what it's about, just watch the first one. I think that's all you need. It leaves you with a good cliffhanger, and if that's all you want, just watch that one.
Yep. I agree. I think that, you can, if the series is fine. It's has enjoyable moments throughout. The best one is the first one, obviously. The second one has some good moments to it and definitely worth the watch at least once. And I would say the third one is at least worth one watch. And because it's not a terrible movie. It doesn't really sit in line with the others so much, but it's got a few little things here and there that are kind of fun. But but yeah, I mean, if you're only looking to watch one, just watch the original Reanimator. It's a classic. It holds together well, and it's a pretty complete story in and of itself. And you don't necessarily need to watch anything else past that. But
I think that the third one can be really summarized by the fact that there's a fight between a penis and a rat. I think
yeah,
that's really all you need to know about the third one is
yeah.
that does occur, and and in a surprise upset, the penis wins.
Well, if that doesn't tell you, if that isn't enough to get you to watch that movie, then I don't know what it is. So, and I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, why
Um,
don't you tell people where they can find you online?
yeah, you can find me at Saber Vista on Twitter or X now, I guess. And you can find me at Saber, I believe it's hyphen Vista on YouTube. And you can also find me at Saber Vista on Instagram. Um, trying to get some more content up there, so it might look a little barren when you guys look at it, but hopefully, if this is in a like few months from when this releases, maybe there's some more stuff up there. And but otherwise, I've really enjoyed talking about Herbert West Reanimator.
Yeah.
I always love talking about HP Lovecraft. He's a quirky mind with a lot of quirky stories, and so I definitely am interested if we did some more Stuart Gordon films. I haven't seen
Yeah.
many of his movies. Seems like he, at least from what I watched with Herbert West, it seems like he read the source material and honestly some of the closest book adaptations that I've ever seen.
Right.
And so I'd be interested to watch Dagon and Castle Freak and
From
From
Beyond.
Beyond,
Yeah.
uh, and seeing how he interprets those stories as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we'll have to give those a watch and do an episode on them. So sounds
Yeah, I
good.
think
All
that's
right. Well,
another good trilogy.
right. Stuart Gordon's Lovecraft movies.
Mythos.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. I appreciate you coming on, and we'll definitely have you on again. Hopefully soon. We'll
Yeah,
see how the schedules shakes out.
yeah. I'm sure you gotta give a break on the Cosmic Horror episodes.
Yeah. All right.
All right, thank you.
Thanks again to Harrison for joining me. On Friday, Ollie Deitch joins me to talk about Captain America Civil War. And on Monday, we start a new series on the Saw franchise. Ariel Power Shop joins me to talk about Saw 1 and 2. Thanks for listening. Creepy and Geeky is a part of the Morbidly Beautiful podcast network. Please check out morbidlybeautiful.com/podcasts for more great shows. If you like what you've heard, please consider giving the show 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, please share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at creepyandgeeky.com. Music for the podcast is Gratitude, composed by Jerry Smith. You can follow the podcast on social media at Creepy and Geeky on both Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to follow me, I'm GeekThulu on Twitter and Blue Sky, and geek.thulu on Instagram. You can support the podcast by ordering teas and more on TeePublic or by donating to the coffee page. All of the links are in the show notes. Finally, don't forget, stay creepy.